This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 166.
The simplest way to do that is to create the best learning experience for everyone, which is, the thing that we always talk about now, or I say we, but a lot of people talk about now is universal design for learning, right?
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Kennerman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I'm here with my co-host, Mrs. Jessica, coaching her way to co-hosting Psalm. This was the perfect guest for you in your former teaching role, your now coaching role, and now your co-host role.
Absolutely. It was so exciting looking at the notes and preparing for tonight and just seeing everything with inclusion and universal design and just everything that I'm kind of immersed in every single day. And to be able to talk to someone, across the U.S. doing the same work and seeing some of the same struggles, hearing that, but also knowing that the work is so important and just seeing how it can be done in these different spaces in our schools is incredible and encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. We spend a lot of time talking about special ed and supporting students and programs. And our guest, Diana Fannon, has a wealth of knowledge to add to that as well as you. And we do talk about universal design for learning for a portion of our conversation. And I actually don't feel like we defined it during the conversation. So do you want to give a quick elevator pitch on UDL for our audience just to help them as they listen?
Sure. And hopefully I don't mess it up too much. But, looking at UDL, and I will say this, that CAST, who kind of puts out the guidelines for UDL, is currently updating them. And so it won't be huge changes, but that's an exciting thing to see coming. But really looking at our planning for learning and providing multiple means of expression for students to be able to show us what they know and what they've learned. So if we're looking at comprehension, do we have to have them write, or can they speak? Can they dictate into the computer? And then those multiple means of taking that learning in. So can we, if it's a literacy lesson, I've seen students that are looking at a summary sheet, so an abbreviated version, listening to the book or reading it themselves. So really making sure we're providing students different ways, not only to receive the information we're teaching, but also to then be able to show us what they learn and breaking down those barriers ahead of time. And so when we anticipate what's going to be in the place for, in the way for students to learn and take those barriers down, all students are able to achieve at higher levels.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And I think this conversation is beneficial for administrators, for teachers, for special ed teachers, just really thinking about how we are creating the best learning environments possible for our students and the benefits that has both on special education students as well as regular education students. So we will hear from Teach Better Network and then jump right into our conversation with Diana Fannon.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcast. Now let's get back to the episode.
Hi, Diana. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Jessica and I are super excited to have you be a part of this conversation. So kick things off for us nice and simple. Please officially introduce yourself. Let our audience know where you are coming from and give us a snapshot of your career in education.
Sure. So I am coming from Los Angeles, California, currently. My living room with a little almost 3-year-old running around. So little Miss Rachel in the background, as you do. But my career is, I dabbled a little bit outside of education. Had a moment in pharmaceutical sales where I realized that was not where I was going to live. And then I started as a classroom teacher. I've worked mostly in South and East Los Angeles when I was working in schools. I'm bilingual in Spanish, so that kept me in, East and South LA, and I loved it. I found myself, even though I wanted a shorter commute, I found myself really, really loving the communities that I was working with. And so then after that, I did learn, though, that classroom teaching was not for me, but it did give me a good perspective. And I also have so much more respect for what classroom teachers are doing. But I moved into school psychology, and that was the perfect fit for me. So I was a bilingual school psychologist. I worked for Los Angeles Unified for a really long time, really large district. You learn a lot working for that type of a district. And I moved into administration. So I supervised school psychologists. I was kind of reluctant to leave working with the students, but I also knew that for me, I wanted to be part of the change from a larger level, looking kind of at the systems. And so I did that for a while, where I supervised a school psychologist. And then I worked for a little bit as a dispute resolution coordinator. So I worked with the families and helped them resolve their complaints with their individualized education program. So students who were in special education, parents had, complaints, and they didn't want to file for formal due process. And then now I'm currently a director of special education at a much smaller school district, Culver City in Los Angeles. And I also, on the side, recently started Disability Ed Pros, where I am trying to work with, I'm hoping to provide education to parents who can be their own advocates, so that they walk in feeling prepared and confident and educated, and it doesn't feel as one-sided, because it can. I just had my son's first IEP, and I know the system, and it's still really scary and really emotional. So that's kind of my journey, as short as I can make it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. What did you find challenging about being a classroom teacher? And also, I'm sure you recognized skill sets or assets you had as a classroom teacher that you felt would better serve you as a school psychologist. What was that niche that helped you fall into that? And I have a second layer to that question. If you went back into teaching in a regular ed classroom,
right,
what do you think you would bring back that you learned from that position, maybe specifically as a school psychologist or with other avenues you've gone down as well?
So many good questions. I don't know if I'm going to remember them all, but I will say, what's challenging about being a classroom teacher? Everything. It is just, it's a really, really hard job. I've heard people say that being a site administrator is the most challenging job. I would say that being a classroom teacher is the most challenging job, hands down, because you are everything to those kids, particularly in elementary school. Not to take away from secondary, but in elementary, you are doing everything for the children. And being a massive proponent of inclusive education, we are asking you to know special ed, not to know everything, but we're asking you to be familiar with it. We're asking teachers to do literally everything for all the children in a cute little 6-hour day with a few breaks. So it is really challenging. And I think that for me as a classroom teacher, when I was there, what was challenging for me personally was, I don't know how to put it exactly, because I loved the kids, and that was my strength, right? So I loved connecting with the kids, the social emotional piece of it, connecting with the families, connecting with the students, all of the things I was able to do as a school psychologist, which is why that was a better fit for me. But the challenging piece for me was honestly the teaching piece of it. Not like, because I still teach now, right? I do professional development. I connect on that kind of level with students, but the younger age, my mom kept telling me, you really should teach high school, and I ignored her. You really should teach high school, and I ignored her. So I think my mistake was on the elementary level. But neither here nor there. I just think that I can work with adults on the professional development and the teaching piece of it. I think the actual just delivering information to small children was not my strong suit. And I'm happy to say that, and happy to let other people who are, I've seen people, some of the teachers that we have are incredible. That was not me. My stuff never looked that way. I mean, I was in the era of open court, so it was not like, there were other challenges with that, but it just wasn't for me. And then the part to that question was, if I went back now, what would look different? I think that so much, right? What I've learned about accommodating kids with sensory challenges and being able to bring all of that into the classroom. And I don't know that I didn't bring it in, but I think my classroom would just be a welcoming place from the moment they walked in. It would be all of the things that I see, because I've seen so many good teachers now over the last 20 years. I have seen so much good happen over these years that I would love to be able to bring it in, and I would love to be able to see how I could incorporate that, and to be able to maybe even be a better teacher because I've been able to see other people do it. I don't know that I would ever do it, but I'm really, because there are people who are just better at it. There's no reason. Everybody can do what they're good at, and that wasn't it for me. So I don't know if that answers the question.
I can relate to that, thinking about going into classrooms and seeing, like, I miss the classroom every day, and I try to be in them as much as possible, so that I need that. But when I can go to a teacher that's having a struggle or having a problem and say, let me tell you what this person did, these things that we don't get to step outside of our classrooms or buildings very often. And then to now be able to see, as a classroom teacher, but now to be able to see the amazing things people are doing that I had no idea. It's incredible just to be able to say, this is what they're doing, try it. Not, look what I can do. Let me tell you about this amazing educator down the hall or in the next building over. And it's like, gosh, if I could pull all of this back into what I could do in the classroom, I think it's the best professional development, just what's happening in that amazing classroom down the hall.
I completely agree. I think having perspective and having input from other people and having other ideas, because even now as a director or as sort of building my own business, I love hearing from other people. I love seeing what's going on in other places.
Thinking about regular ed teachers that are working with students that are being included into their classroom, regardless of what type of special education classroom they're coming from, what would you say is one of the best pieces of advice you could give to them for how to navigate it from all perspectives, not just including the students, but also providing them the best learning experiences, how to incorporate them and navigate that with their regular ed students, as well as recognizing the legal ramifications that come along with it as well?
So I think there are two aspects, sort of giving them the best learning experience. I think the simplest way to do that is to create the best learning experience for everyone, which is, the thing that we always talk about now, or I say we, but a lot of people talk about now, is universal design for learning, right? So if you are building an experience that can address all of the learners, then everyone, even students who don't have any kind of a specific learning plan, which is, like a 504 or an IEP, or anything, we can give accommodations, we can support learners even without any of those things. So if we're using universal design for learning in a classroom, and the analogy that I was given long ago when I was first learning about it was, if you have a bunch of friends coming over or a bunch of your family or whomever coming to your house and you don't know what kind of food allergies they have, then you create a meal that would accommodate them without knowing. So you have like a taco bar set up, but nothing is mixed together. So you've got the cheese separated, you've got the meat separated, you have maybe a vegan meat option, you have a bunch of veggies, and it's all separated, even though you don't know who's coming, right? You have no idea, but it still works. And I think about the classroom like that, which is, if you can use universal design for learning in a way that meets those needs before you even know what they are, your kids will be better off for it. Now, when it comes to the legal aspect of it, the best thing you can do is simply, you don't have to know all of the IEP. It helps. But as a general ed teacher, the best thing you can do is know what the accommodations and modifications are. And that if you don't have it, ask for it. Now, you shouldn't have to ask for it, but if you do, then that's all you need to ask for. And then if you have time, you can ask for more later. But that's really all you need to do. And I say all like it's not very much. It is a lot. But those things are what you can do.
And I've been surprised at the amount of teachers just working in a space where I'm supporting those inclusive classrooms and those collaborative relationships. Teachers who are like, I've never seen the IEP. the IEP that maybe even they signed, I didn't know I could see it. And so I
Right.
think, we always expect them to print off that accommodations page. You have to have that. But when a teacher can really see that IEP, I was working with one the other day, the SPED teacher, and she's like, we have all this paperwork and all this data from the gen ed teacher when I wasn't in there. And it was better data than she ever got. And it was in the gen ed setting without the SPED support. So when we're
Right.
trying to decide what does this child still need, where are we at now? And to be able to see, the teacher knew what those IEP goals were. So she was able to, the gen ed teacher, she was able to
Yes.
keep that work and have that data. And what rich information to be able to have and share with parents of this is when your child's SPED provider wasn't in the room, and look at all that they're capable of. But I think a lot of gen ed teachers, they're scared and they haven't had to necessarily be responsible for that. They're scared of
Yes.
some of the legal ramifications. What if I don't take enough or do enough? But you're right. They don't have to know all, but if they're a part of that team and they're a true member of knowing what the child's working on, knowing those critical areas that we're trying to meet, it can be incredible, the growth for the student.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I love for teachers to know is that many of our teachers are already doing what's in there, and I think that's the thing to let them know, which is we don't most of it, you just need to know that what you're doing is part of the IEP.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes it's just tweaking something a little bit, sometimes it's just keeping documentation of it, sometimes it's just paying a little closer attention, but it's not that much different. It's just good teaching, but it's tailored to the student's needs. So it's not, you don't have to know everything about special ed just to know what the student's individualized plan is.
Jessica, how has your perspective on this shifted and changed over your career,
Yeah,
given the amount of experience you have in special ed?
It's definitely been, I think that in Arkansas, it's been a huge shift. We were identified as having way too many children taught in more restrictive settings at a state level. And it was just one of these things. I heard somebody describe the other day, they're like, we created this really great system for the teachers. Like, this is what worked for, and not just the teachers, but for our administrators to be able to set their schedule. Like, it fit in this really neat box at the building level, but it wasn't great for kids. And so it has been a hard shift, and it continues to be an adjustment. I feel like sometimes on a daily basis of knowing, okay, we know this is coming. We know these changes are here. What do we need to do? And I think I wanted to go back to the universal design piece, because there's a lot of even special education teachers who are not familiar with universal design for learning. And it really is that anticipating the barriers ahead of time and knowing that if I make it more accessible for this child, then typically all students are going to benefit from that. And I heard a speaker say, and I wonder if this is something that you've encountered in your work, that a teacher that was in a group, we were doing some universal design work, and she said, what happens with the kid listens to the book that day instead of reading it? Like, we're just going to let them listen to it when they can read just fine. And the speaker was like, okay, fair enough. Like, that is a fair question. But what about if that child's on the football team or baseball team, whatever it is, they had to work and they were up super late last night. They barely got any sleep because they were trying to catch up on homework and do these other things, and they're tired. And today they just need to listen to it. Like, why would we not just take that barrier of exhaustion out of their way and let them hear it today? No, they can still follow along in the book, but we're not decreasing the rigor. And I wonder, is that an issue you get a lot? We always hear, like, well, you're going to make it too easy for them.
It's a huge one. I've particularly noticed less so at elementary, more so at high school.
Yes.
Particularly because we always have the debate over what is a university approved course and what is not, and are we watering it down too much?
Mm-hmm.
And so yes, we have that a lot, and that's where we have the conversation, kind of what I mentioned earlier, which is you can give every kid in your class an accommodation. You're not it's not what they're learning, it's how they're learning. And so we go into the unending debate about what's an accommodation, what's a modification. But yes, we have that, we can't change this because then they're not getting what they're supposed to be getting. And people, some of our teachers, and I've seen this everywhere, so it's not even limited to what I've personally encountered. I've heard it from a number of people over, the lesson that the teacher's prepared or what they've worked on. And so sometimes it's personal. It feels personal, I guess is what I mean. Like, I think teachers feel protective over the lesson. They feel protective over the standards. They feel protective over the high school diploma. There is a feeling that it's very prized, I think, rather than viewing it as, and this is kind of a social justice. So we've tried all kinds of different ways of promoting inclusion or presenting it, I guess is a better way to say it, which is that it really is a social justice issue, right? It isn't so much about a disability movement rather than needing to support from a social justice angle, right? Which I guess is a disability rights, but we've tried all the different angles because of that view sometimes that it feels like, well, it's my lesson, and sometimes I think it's just time, but sometimes it feels like it's taking too long, right? So yes, we get that a lot.
And it's such an interesting, we've had to really shift our focus. Number one, what are we actually assessing, and what is that mastery level? Sometimes what we're looking for and asking kids is above like what we've determined that essential standard, that mastery level of that is. Because we of course we want to push them and we want to provide those opportunities, but really what is the standard and what are we assessing? And then we as a state, this is our first year with a brand new state standardized test, and we have math and science is allowed to be read aloud to every child now. But we gave students, it was a U-part, it was an assessment to see if it was read to them, what would happen to their comprehension. And so we have certain students that on the reading portion of the state test are having it read to them if if they were in the red and they were able to move to the green. And there was a student that I had formerly that when it was read to him, he went from 0% reading it himself to 100% on grade level comprehension, to the point that they were like, this can't be right, and gave it again, and he was able to do it again. And so it was a whole shift of like, now we know when we provide him this tool, which is what we have to do for all kids, look at what he can do. And it has shifted. It could change his life outcomes knowing
that's incredible.
We provide this. And I think that's what it comes down to, these inclusive opportunities. We're preparing kids for after K-12. They don't stay with us forever. And
it talks about those legal standards, right? Which is the high expectations, right?
Yes.
Like, because it's not only what we should be doing as educators, it's what we are required to do by law, which is to set high expectations in light of their disability. And I think even when we don't know we're doing it, we're capping that sometimes.
Yes.
And we think, oh, well, they're here, so we can get them here. But what if we can get them here, right?
Yeah, it's
incredible.
It's a crazy, the inclusive work. I read in a book one time about like the wording, I think was stifling, like we've stifled them with low expectations and limited the opportunities for their future. And I just remember being like, no more, this can't be. And I think, some of that is kind of what led to the work in our state, and my district's been incredibly supportive. So it's great to see, different district states realize we can do better, not just for our kids with IEPs, but for all kids. And when we put these practices into place, when you have a co-taught or even just like a partially inclusive classroom, you take that gen ed content teacher and give them a sped teacher who knows how to like fill the gaps and make that work accessible for every kid, your English language learners, your kids who didn't qualify, the one who moved from out of state, who's behind. The growth we are seeing is incredible. And yes, not every kid's achieving on grade level yet, but they're growing, and they're getting more than a year's worth of growth, which we know how valuable that is.
That's incredible. I love this.
I think a lot of it, hearing what you're saying, a lot of it boils down to two of realigning or reassessing or just reviewing as teachers why we're doing what we're doing.
Yes.
And why we're teaching what we're teaching. Like you were saying, Diana, about holding on to the diploma or the standards or the lessons. What I see nowadays with teachers is the one of the big movements, especially elementary, is programs, right? These programs that they're buying for RELA, for math, for science, for social studies. And then you have that in combination with other things. I feel like teachers are losing the art of teaching. They're losing the ability to design lessons and design learning for students. And then with that, they're losing their ability to think about how to differentiate, how to assess students, how to accommodate students. And again, why they're teaching what they're teaching, they're losing sight of what the standards actually are. And, I've had conversation with teachers as a coach and now as an interim principal, this lesson in this program is aligned to Common Core. It is not aligned to Pennsylvania. This lesson is actually worthless if you do this canned lesson from this program. Doesn't mean that the concepts aren't great, but getting teachers to understand the difference between a program and the standards and our district curriculum, all of those things I feel like are getting lost. And with that is the ability to effectively accommodate for students or effectively evaluate what do they need. Yeah. I've had students in my classroom who, when I taught 5th grade, we were one of the programs for the autistic students. And, I had a student who was very well below grade level in every subject, but was included for science and social studies. When we were doing group projects, my goal was that this student was involved in socializing with his 2 other group members. That was the goal. Did I need him to know all of the content that we were learning? No, it didn't matter. I wanted him socializing and being like a real member of the team on the project that they were working on. And so I just think it's important, but at the same time, it's another layer for teachers to evaluate and to think about when they're trying to design learning for all their students.
I agree with you. And I think it's hard too. Like everything you just said, I think about because I hear this from my teachers and sometimes I get frustrated by it, but I also listen to everything you just rattled off that's involved in planning. And it requires so much time, and it's a skill too. You don't just, you learn, I don't know, you learn how to lesson plan for maybe a little bit throughout every class in grad school, but then is it addressed again? Not really. Mm-hmm. So unless your district is walking you through that, unless your district is giving you time, and if you're taking it, right? So unless it's somehow required and paid, and there's so many layers to this that I see that I now, being where I am aware of, that I don't know if I wasn't aware of it or just didn't appreciate it until we were working on this kind of trying to really improve. We've made a ton of progress in my district, but there's still so much. And right. I see it in every other district, right?
Yeah. And before you jump in, Jessica, I agree with what you're saying. I don't believe it's the responsibility of the teachers. I believe it's the responsibility of the administrators. And I'm not pointing the finger at anyone when I say this, but I think a lot of times the administrators don't realize what these programs and just what the last 10 years of education has done to the professionalism and the ability of teachers. And their lack of, and I don't mean this in a negative way, I just mean it in a reality of everything that classroom teachers have to do, their lack of knowledge of the standards. Right. And everything that keeps changing and going on, I think that it needs to be fixed with professional learning more than just saying teachers, you should know the standards.
Right. Well, it's a muscle you have to flex like anything, right? Like anything you don't use on a regular basis.
Yeah. And the standards is a critical piece of it. And our district has been doing a lot of work in Arkansas as a whole with the professional learning communities and establishing those essential standards. But I remember when it started, as a SPED teacher, self-contained room, I wasn't really included in a lot of those meetings. And then it was like, oh, well, this would be a good group for you to come to. And I had amazing support and administration. It just was kind of that always afterthought. And I remember the first meeting going to with them and listening to them talk about this list of things that they decided every kid had to know by the time they left first grade, whatever grade it was. So not only did we have our state standards, the district curriculum guide, these were the standards that every child in our grade was going to know before they left. And I was like, so you're telling me this is my new IEP goal? This is what I should aim my IEP goals towards? And they just looked at me like I was like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, no one's ever given me this beautiful list of this is what every child in this grade we demand. We are going to demand that they learn. And if they don't learn it, we're going to go back and teach it again. And I was like, okay. So when they can't meet that first grade standard, you're telling me there's aligned kindergarten standards I can look down to. And as a SPED teacher, I just kind of been left out of that piece of the learning. And it was very eye-opening to me how critical the standards were for us to know like how we can support kids, and then to have those aligned across the grade levels. It made my IEPs, I feel like, so much stronger. And I wasn't just thinking like, yes, of course I need to look at that child's needs and address those needs, but if my goal is to get them to continue to grow as close to that grade level as possible, then I need to know what those grade level teachers are doing and partner with them, so I can get the students that I'm serving as close as possible. So it was for me, it was such an eye opener of like, this is a piece of my own learning that I need to be better at. And I know there's tons of other teachers like that. And we're sometimes afraid to say like what we don't know. We don't want to admit that, but having that space to learn and those teachers to partner with, that's when I really started to see growth in my students that I had. And then it was easier to move them to those more inclusive settings because they had more access to grade level curriculum, which is such an issue in special education as a whole, is really ensuring access to that grade level content.
Right. And I will say that's one thing that we've done in our district is for the last 3 years, we've had all of our special education teachers have been with the general education teachers for all of the professional development. So for that reason, so that they know what's going on, so that they're exposed, even if they're not using everything in the classroom, so that they know. So if their kids, because we only have, like for elementary, for example, we only have 2 self-contained programs in our district. So everything else is in the gen ed classroom. But the problem is, and this is like a special ed side of things, that means I have less access to the teachers, right? So I have to figure out then, when are we working on IEPs? When are we, making sure that they're legally defensible? And so that has suffered, and that has had to be like, we'll offer some after school, but if they don't come, they don't come. Right. So there's always a push and pull because there is such limited time, and people come, of course they come, when we offer paid PD, but it is limited. And, we've had 2 full day, whole district PD days on inclusion. And so we offered like multiple sessions. We had like 36 sessions in the first one and 24 in the second. And some of them were really great. Some of them weren't so great, but by and large, we had pretty good feedback. Now I needed to take like a month vacation after we planned it, but we were making, there's sort of like for everything that goes well, there's always like 100 things you think of that need to be shifted, or where you're missing something, or where you still hear that people aren't happy. Right. So I don't know. I'm still looking for like the way to do it perfectly. I don't think one exists.
No, not yet.
But I do like to hear where there's more systems in place. That's the thing. And like where there's mechanisms for feedback and input from teachers and from administrators and yeah.
How much? So I've seen a little bit of a different side of special education being in my principal position.
Yeah.
And how much of, I don't want to say an issue, but how much I'll just use the word issue. How much of an issue is assessing, identifying, and placing students in effective programs and kind of launching them off on a positive start? How much of that do you think is difficult to navigate, difficult for maybe new special ed teachers or new special ed directors to navigate? And do you have any recommendations for helping a process of identifying and placing students be a little bit more effective?
So I think generally speaking, it depends on the size of your district. I would say that's one. So working in a smaller district, I think we don't have a ton of challenges with that. Coming from a much larger district, yes. It is different because you don't have sort of the human element to it, because you're not connecting always. So that is my recommendation. Like when I was a school psychologist, no matter what the situation was, I always called parents, right? I was always in touch with parents, especially if there was a student, for example, who wasn't going to be eligible. That was always a phone call. There were no surprises, because people don't always like when I use the term I'm about to say, but we are in a customer service business. So if we have unhappy customers, then we have bad outcomes, no matter if it's what they wanted or didn't want. So that is how due process ends up on my desk, right? That is how parents file for due process, because somewhere along the line, it doesn't, maybe we screwed up too. Like that happens too. But often if they were happy and we screwed up, then they would come directly to me rather than filing for due process. So I guess I think that the best recommendation I can give any member of any special ed team is frequent contact with the parents. Don't surprise them with anything. And even if it's not an outcome they're going to want, do the best you can to walk them through it and keep the jargon out of it and make them feel comfortable, because a lot of people are traumatized by this, right? Parents walk into these school settings and it is scary. And teachers, same thing on the teacher side, actually, I would say. Teachers and admin, do the best that you can to prepare them. For example, if it's not a student who's already at their school, do the best you can to prepare them and give them the information they need. Because I have had some teachers who did not react positively when they felt like they should have been given more information. And they were new to the district or new to the school or new just to the student. And so I think I have learned lessons from that in just handling things differently. I think everyone just wants as much communication as possible, as much transparency, as much preparation, because I always think, like, no matter what it appears, no matter how it comes off, nobody got into education to get rich, right? Everyone wants to serve the students. So they want, and so, and I have a lot of little sayings that I use, but like, people's behaviors are about them, not about you. So sometimes it feels personal, but it's usually not. So if a teacher or an administrator or a parent, whoever it is, it's usually because they're trying to control something, or they're worried, or they're scared, or they want to do better. And if I can in some way help that, and if I didn't do it right one time, I do it better the next. But usually it's because of missing information, lack of communication. And so with new assessments, new eligibilities, communicate with the parents, over communicate with the parents, and talk to the school, let them know, support them in the early stages if you can show up. I mean, some of the kids won't need this much, right? I'm overdoing it here. Like, if you have a kid who has a learning disability who's going to pop into the class, make sure the teacher has the IEP, check in, and then you can probably go on your way. But if you have a kid, like if there are any behaviors or anything like that that have a potential to disrupt the class, then those are the ones you already know you're going to hear about that. So do everything you can to support the teachers and support the school. I mean, I can go on about that forever with the behavior stuff, but.
Yeah. And I think that there is such a, I think you having a psych examiner background and like combining that is huge, because it has been like having to learn to look at these reports in a different way, not just as the classroom teacher who's been given the report and then making those programming for the decisions, but in a more administrative role of helping to determine like the eligibility and what disability category. But then having people understand, like, this student that shows up with an autism diagnosis, that doesn't immediately mean they're going to have an IEP. It certainly doesn't mean that they're immediately going to be in another classroom. And so that has been a very eye-opening thing and not just, like you said, it's not just the parents, it's a teacher to say, like, well, they came in with this, they have this diagnosis, so surely they'll have this, and looking at that impact on their education. And again, of course, always starting with what can we put into place before a movement, before a change in setting, like what supports are already there. In a universally designed classroom, a lot of it should already be in place. But I think you're so right. Oftentimes with parents, we've been going through a lot. We've got a group of kids that's moving up to our junior high who have a unique set of needs, and they're all in the same class. And some of them were in my class previously, but meeting with parents and saying, like, what are your hopes for your child? Number one, like, what do you see this programming look like? And then let's talk about what supports we can put in place, and having that talk before we sit down at a meeting and tell them what we're going to program for their child, letting them be a meaningful contributor to that and communicating with them ahead of time. It's going to save us from due process, most likely. It's certainly going to save us from a very contentious IEP conference. just opening up that door for communication. I think that when parents don't feel like they're having to break down the door to get into what they want when it's open for them, those outcomes are going to be so much better. And those partnerships between our educators and our caregivers, we're truly going to be working together. But again, bringing that general education voice into it, especially if they're going to be expected to be a provider, because their voice and their experience does matter.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier accommodation and modification and the difference between them. You want to weigh in on the conversation at all?
Yeah. So, I think that I've had so many conversations about this, and I think it's really, really important, especially in the wake of COVID-19. I think one of the things that came up a lot was using assistive technology and the way we can utilize all of the, the extensions on our Chrome and how kids can use that. And we've done a lot of use of text to read, write to read, all of the co-writer, co-reader. We've done that in our district quite a bit, and we got just a whole district-wide subscription so we can learn to support our kids and train our teachers a little better and have like a designated person. But generally speaking, there are some things that as accommodations, accommodation is just the how, right? So it's how we support our kids in accessing. So, it could be something that's a little bit shorter. It could be extended time on tests. It could be, it doesn't change the substantive material that they're learning. And so, I know that I have an audience here who probably knows that, but I think it's important. And I think that, and then with the modifications, that's the what. And so that really can change the actual material that they're learning. And that would be something that might change, for example, for some of our students who have an IEP, that might take them from a diploma to, depending on what state you're in, depending what it's called there. Some people call it their certificate of completion. California now has something called an alternative diploma pathway, which is very exciting. Oh, you have it in Arkansas too?
Yes. And they make
That's
sure
awesome.
to label it as that so that the child did.
So they actually get a diploma, which is something that our Department of Rehab has worked on. But that's the difference, right, with the modifications, and why it's so important that our teachers don't take it lightly when we're looking at modifying a curriculum, and that they do understand the difference. And listen, there are special ed teachers who are still having this debate after being in the field for years over, is it a modification or is it an accommodation? But I think that the how and the what is the simplest way to put it, because it really, if it's just the sort of the modality versus the actual substance, then you're not really modifying something. So, and if it's still the same standard, if they're really getting the content of that standard, and if, for example, they want to assess their learning in a different way, that's okay. If they just need to demonstrate mastery or content mastery, and they want to, do a speech instead of an essay, and it's not a writing assignment, that's okay. And I think that's something, again, some of our teachers are learning. Now, if we're talking about math and they want to do a speech, then that's different, right? Like we don't do an expository, or not an expository, a monologue when we're talking about, math. But generally speaking, I think it does take some getting used to, especially for teachers who've been doing it a little bit longer, to understand that there is some flexibility in the way you can demonstrate content mastery. So that's, I don't know, Jessica, if you have. Sorry, no. I'm not the host.
No.
Like Jessica, would you like to add anything?
It is a hard thing to, for teachers to wrap their brains around. And I think, in looking at inclusive education and again, the shift in so many places to providing more of that, we hear that a lot. Like, well, we're doing a 4-digit by 4-digit multiplication and they're only doing single or double. And yes, we know that. We know. And so, there's one of the lawsuits that's been brought up in some of these discussions it was called the Hyde decision. And basically the courts ruled in favor of the family that the measure is that the child can make progress on their IEP goals in the general education classroom, even when work was modified. And so like showing the, educators the precedence of that, like we know that this child who maybe has been in a much more restrictive setting and is now in your classroom is not doing the work that at the same rigor as the rest of your students, that, that it's going to have to be modified for them to be able to access it. But in doing that, what they are going to have, you mentioned earlier, Ken, like they're in there for the social piece, but it's so hard for us because I've done that for years, like to know what kids are actually picking up by working with those partners and the academic skills that they may be gaining just from hearing it, because they're not hearing it in their other classroom, and they're not able to have those rich discussions and to have that dialogue with peers. I had a video sent to me today. Again, a student of mine, fourth grade of mine, because they're always ours, she's in fourth grade now. First time out of a self-contained class in a fully inclusive setting. She still gets some pull-out interventions, but the assistant principal, who's a dear friend of mine, was doing 4-digit by 4-digit subtraction with her. This was anywhere where she was at the beginning of the year. I mean, we were single digit on a good day with manipulatives, but just hearing her talk through, well, I didn't have enough, from here. So I had to take this 9 and make it, an 8, and just to hear the language of talking through that problem. And it's because she's been surrounded by that rich content and those typical peers who are able to kind of talk through some of that, even though she still struggled to explain it and solve it, to hear the thought process behind it. And I love that. It's amazing because that piece can't necessarily be measured on that assessment, but there is going to be, she's taking the standard assessment. So we got to make sure she's learning that standard curriculum. But it's incredible. I think even when we give kids opportunities just for that social piece, which is so important, what they are going to pick up from just being surrounded by that high level of learning and the high expectations.
100%. I love that.
I do think that the expectations piece is so important. And I know you just mentioned it now, Jessica, and you mentioned it much earlier, Diana, in having high expectations for all of our students, especially students with IEPs, and not allowing that to lessen the challenges that we give to them and change our expectations and over scaffold at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of my best pieces of advice I can give to newer teachers or teachers trying something for the first time or teaching maybe a new unit or a new course as a secondary teacher is when you're trying something new, plan as little as possible and see how it goes, right? Especially with projects, I think this is where you really see the value in it. Anytime I was trying some sort of long-term project or project-based learning thing or something more open-ended for my students, I would plan as little as I possibly could to see how much they needed for me to get them moving in the right direction, right? I knew what the end goal was. I knew what we wanted to create, or I knew what we wanted to accomplish. And I found a way to project that and convey that to the students. But the steps along the way, the process to get there, I wouldn't define. And I would just see. And sometimes that was enough. They didn't need that. And other times it was like, they all get stuck at this spot. It's like, okay, this becomes a mini lesson that I insert, or this becomes part of the initial directions, or this becomes a scaffold I put into place. But when you over scaffold, you don't know what they could do. You don't know where you are stifling their abilities because you've already provided too much for them. Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier to see where you missed support or where you missed scaffolds or where you missed directions and then insert it later. And you're not damaging the kids that you have, and you're going to be better for the kids that you have after that.
Yeah. I think that's totally true. And then they surprise you sometimes. What kids come up with, it's shocking to see how their little brains work sometimes. And you're like, how did you get there? Yeah. I mean, in a good way, right? In the best way possible. I agree with that. I think that's totally true.
Ken, I was thinking about last time we were on the show together, you were talking about like a project that your students were doing and like how it just grew and blew up and the things like that could be incorporated into students' days, and just so many different, yes, there's the academic skills, but there's so many other places that students can be included. And these skill areas or these interest areas where they can excel. And it may be in athletics, it may be choir or art. But opening up all of those doors and seeing what the interest level is, and knowing that when that child feels success in that one space, what what it's going to build in them to be able to try and persevere through some other difficult tasks. But I think about how neat those opportunities are for kids, and how really it truly does change their opinion of what they see themselves capable of when they have success in whatever that space is.
And what their peers might think of them too.
Yes.
And seeing them shine and saying like, oh wow, like I didn't know he could do that.
Yes.
Yeah, he's got some pretty good talents. He might not be good at some other things that you traditionally do, but look at what he can do, and it changes everyone's perspective.
Yeah,
I agree with that completely.
And that's amazing to see other students see, our students with IEPs through that different lens. I remember my daughter saying, one of my students in my class coming into her class, and she came back that day and she was like, he's better at math than me. And I was like, oh yeah. Brilliant. But for her to recognize that, I was just like, how cool to know.
It's powerful.
Yes, it's powerful. And what is she going to say to other people? And what did other people see that now, he's not a kid that's in sped. He is.
Well, and it's a much better learning experience than teachers saying, hey, look at this.
Yes.
Well, and because I think that one of the things I've wanted to avoid in creating inclusive experiences for our kids is that bringing students with disabilities or bringing our students with IEPs or 504s or whatever it is in and mixing with our neurotypical kids is I've wanted to avoid it feeling like a project for the kids or the neurotypical kids, because when there are ways to create more organic feeling or authentic experiences, but sometimes it does seem to sort of feel like, oh, I'm going to be friends with him for a period, or I'm going to hang out with him. And listen, it's not that those experiences aren't helpful, and the lunch peers and all of those peer tutoring, whatever, but it's hard to find ways to do things where it doesn't feel like they're doing a favor in some way. And I think what you just described, Jessica and Ken both, things like that happening organically in a class where kids are given an opportunity to shine, where there is an open-ended activity, where there is something where a kid just goes and says, oh my God, did you know how good this kid is at math, or whatever their name is at math? And it just is a passing conversation. That's the kind of thing that grows. Not to minimize, again, we still have to have room, I think, for those other types of activities. But I love that idea.
So I would love to continue this conversation, but I want to be cognizant of our time and jump into our exit ticket, which are the same 4 questions we ask every guest every week. Question number 1, what is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
Care, and do so by asking, how are you? How have you been? Nothing to do with school. I mean, it can be, but how are you? What's going on at home? Where were you if they were absent? Just questions, personal. Show them that they're missed. Show them that they are valued. Show them that you want them there.
Okay, question number 2. What is the best advice you ever received from a colleague, supervisor, or student?
So this is going to be interesting. Probably not what you're expecting. But it's not that serious. Meaning that we have lives outside. If I were to leave my job tomorrow, somebody else will pick up and do it. So it feels life or death sometimes, and what we're fighting for. I feel it almost every day that these kids everything is so important. I feel like sometimes when I feel like I can't get people to listen, but it can't be that serious. It can't. I have to be able to leave. I have to be able to come home. I've got to be able to give my son. He needs 100% of me. So I have to remember at the end of the day that I've got to be able to leave it at work. I've got to be able to. It doesn't always work, but that was the advice was given in in a much more sort of cavalier way that they're going to forget about you as soon as you're gone. But I choose to reframe it a little bit as it's not that serious. We are here for the kids. We have to remember that, keep them at the forefront, and keep it moving.
Awesome. Okay, question number 3. We know how the school year goes in waves, and there are those days or weeks that we struggle to survive. So this kind of leads into from your last question too.
Yeah.
What is something that every educator needs to hear to power up in that moment of struggle?
I think that it works for me. I don't know if it'll work for everyone, but that it is about the kids. That's why we're here. It is hard. It's bureaucratic. It's messy. People don't listen. You don't feel valued some days. It is the way the system works. I haven't seen it work differently anywhere. Sometimes some work better, right? Some systems run more smoothly, but you will feel that way a lot. Again, we're all in the same system. But I think that if you remember why you're here, and if you remember what you're doing, and if you're talking about kids more than you're talking about adults, you're doing it right, and that's your why. It has to be your why, I think. If you're in it for any other why, then maybe it's, I don't know. I'll stop talking. I think I should end it. Too much narration.
So it's easy to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. What separates the teachers who are the ones constantly seeking to change, innovate, and adopt new teaching strategies?
The willingness to be uncomfortable.
Love it.
Yeah,
that's it.
That's awesome. Okay, so will our audience, if they would like to connect with you in the future, what is the best way to do that?
So I have a website and I have Instagram, and both are Disability Ed Pros. So disabilityedpros.com, or just Instagram is Disability Ed Pros. And I share a lot of tips, and you can find me there, and you can message me. And if you have parents who need support, families, you can send them my way as well.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. This has really been a great conversation, and one that I think is important to have in education, both for the special ed teacher side, the regular ed teacher side, as well as any parents that are listening as well. Just there's a lot of layers, and I think the most important thing is remembering that it's a team effort, that everyone is there to benefit the students the most, and it's about effective communication and effective teamwork to create that reality for the students. So thank you again for your time. And Jessica, why don't you take us on out of here?
Absolutely. I'm so glad we were able to connect tonight. And as we power down this episode, Diana, you left us feeling powered up. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to or watching us on YouTube. Each week, we get to talk to amazing educators who are making a positive impact on the lives of students, their colleagues, administrators, and education as a whole. It's been such a privilege every week to be able to talk to these incredible individuals, learn from them, grow with them, and better myself and all of education through these conversations. If you haven't already, please consider sharing this with a colleague, someone who can benefit and be powered up from the experience of listening to these incredible conversations. Because of Powered Up, we are powering education by empowering you.